Thank you for coming in. My name's David Unjaic. I'm with Google, but I need to obviously qualify that because Google's a big place. So there's Alphabet, and then there's Google, and then there's Google Cloud. And I actually came from a Google Cloud acquisition called Apogee. And so if you haven't heard of Apogee, we're the API company. I actually started with Apogee. Yeah. I already have fans, just one. But I started with Apogee at the beginning, so about 12 years ago, as their first commercial sales or business development person, right? Had a bunch of roles over the years, which is relevant to this conversation, led our vertical strategy for a number of years and moved to Europe and kind of saw what was happening there, helped launch a couple new products. And then we took the company public. And around that same time, PSD2 and open banking were happening in Europe and the UK. And we kind of saw ripples of that starting to form around the world. And so I dedicated myself to banking and spent a couple of years kind of traveling around Europe, talking to banks about APIs and so forth. And so that's the context of this. I'm not with search. I'm not with ads. I'm not with Google Pay. I've got a few comments about those things, but the typical disclaimer, I'm not talking for any of those other groups inside of Google. I'm really taking an API-centric, Apogee-centric view of what I've learned, from the last 2, 3, 4 years, talking and working with banks. So the other thing I'll tell you about this presentation is there's going to be a bunch of super obvious stuff in here probably that many of you might know. I'm hoping that I can actually draw some conclusions from this that maybe you hadn't thought of. And a call to action for a few of you. So I do want to know who I'm talking to, though. So in the room, bankers. Not too bad. Okay. Technologists versus business people. So technology people. Okay, pretty good. Business people. Nice even mix. Awesome. Nice even mix. Okay. So first, some how this is going to work. We got 3 things we're going to talk about today. Talk about some trends that we're seeing. We're talking about some strategy implications of those trends, and then some disruption that we're seeing happening around the world. Right. So first, obviously, trends. Everybody's heard that software is eating the world, right? Not a mystery. I told you this was going to be a really obvious presentation. Software is eating the world, right? Your TV is software. Your camera is software, your alarm clock is software, right? Your radio is software, your remote control is software. Everything's becoming software, right? And yes, as a Google person, I know there are other apps that are not Google apps that are software. But using Google stuff was the easiest way to get this through my compliance department. So, but other things that are becoming software. Bank branches are becoming software, right? The numbers in Canada aren't nearly as brutal as the numbers across the UK and Europe or in the US about the number of bank branch closures, but it's still happening, right? Wealth advisors are becoming software. Probably not at the high end, but certainly at the lower end. This is happening, right? Payments, right? We all know that plastic has been eating cash, and software is eating plastic mostly at this point, right? And in fact, even the cash register that you go pay for that latte is pretty much just software now on an iPad, right? Thanks to Square. So it's a software world, and we'll talk more about this and what the implications are. The second big trend that we see is the rise of platforms and ecosystems in this kind of business model, right? And traditionally, when I say traditionally, I'm talking the last 100, 200, 300 years, right? It's pretty much been like a linear business model, And so linear business model, as you can see from a product business model, is go into the back and if you're a manufacturer, you assemble your raw goods and your subcomponent parts, fit them together and ship out a product. And when you're doing that, supply chains become hugely important, right? And the sales channel becomes hugely important, where you are either selling through your own sales force or you're setting up channels, but it's a very unidirectional push of a product. And that is still true today, but what we've seen over the last decade or two is a rise of platform-based business models and ecosystem-based competition. And a good example, just to give you an idea of what this is like, we'll talk about a couple of them. Windows as an operating system is a platform, right? And even though Microsoft owns some of the products on that platform, Microsoft was extremely good, and I say this as a person who started his high-tech career at Netscape, was extremely good at fostering an ecosystem of other software publishers that built products on their platform, and they fostered a larger ecosystem of resellers and consultants that all installed and operated and delivered those products, right? And the interesting thing about platforms today, when I think about like online platforms, and you guys already know a lot of these examples, right? So a platform like eBay or Amazon, right? Or a platform like Uber or Airbnb. They don't, and this is a classic, everybody's heard this thing. They don't own the cars, they don't own the homes, right? They don't own those rooms. They just operate on top of them and they match supply and demand, right? The interesting thing, though, about that model is the data cycle that you see represented on the screen, right? Where data is pushed out into the ecosystem and then based on the activity on the demand side is pushed back in through the platform. This makes that kind of business model incredibly powerful. And what we've seen over time, like what's the third place rideshare company? What's the second or third place vacation rental company? Right? They struggle, right? They're usually a super distant third and they have to find a niche because this kind of platform and ecosystem competition is generally a winner take most. Where the number one player, gets their unfair share, 60, 80%, whatever it happens to be, and there's a second place that's the foil, and then there's like everybody else, right? I mean, even you think about mobile phone operating systems, there's kind of two choices right now, right? And that's the way a lot of these things play out. And so in a world where platforms and ecosystems exist, and you've got these competitors that are coming in with this, it's super important that you pay attention to what's happening in your particular market, because you can think, oh, well, there's really only going to be, a couple of these big platforms. I think there would be a platform for every market niche. There might be a platform in a specific kind of finance, right, that emerges. There isn't one today, but it could easily happen. The next big trend, has anybody ever caught themselves doing this? You're doing something on your phone, you have a perfectly good laptop or desktop computer in front of you. Anybody? Yeah? Why? Why do we do this? Because it's the ease of use, right? And why is that? Because the constraints of this screen, right, forces the designers to really focus in on making the consumption experience super, super easy. And so it becomes very, very easy, and it's almost become state of the art, and for many companies it's become a competitive advantage, thinking about the consumption experience and making that very easy. And in fact, last week, there was a major telco from Europe who came to our campus, and I was talking to him, and he said that he doesn't see his competitors as being the other major telcos in his area, like a Vodafone or an Orange, or, well, I already told you two that are not, I wasn't talking to. He doesn't see it as them, but he said, I see my competition as being an Amazon or a Facebook or a Google. And so he was actually visiting Silicon Valley to learn more about how he can up his team's software game to get better at experience, because he understood that in his market, he really needed to compete with the best consumption experiences wherever they happen to be. And you'll see a lot of companies, we'll talk more about this as we go along, but this is becoming a big competitive vector for companies. So besides software, besides ecosystems, consumption is a big deal. So we've talked about some trends, so then the implication is, okay, if these are kind of the trends, what do? Right? You lead a bank, you lead a business unit of a bank, you lead a product area in a bank. What should your strategy be when you take software that's eating everything, platforms and ecosystem competition and consumption, and you put them together? Before you embarrass yourself, let me tell you one thing it's not. It's not mobile. And I know, like the last 8-9 years, CEOs have been like, we got to have mobile app, mobile first, everything's mobile first. You see mobile first banks and that kind of thing, but this is actually not your strategy. It is a component of your strategy, but it kind of misses the point, and we'll point out why in a second. We'll do a thought experiment for a minute. People don't want, yeah, see, I told you this was not going to be a really sophisticated conversation, right? People want to read their bank statement, awesome, right? They just want to manage their spending. Consumers don't want a credit card. Even fanatical, like points-obsessed people, right? They actually don't want the card, they just want the points, they want the rewards, right? But they want an easy way to buy things over time. And this last one's a little tricky because I didn't give you all the words. Treasurers don't want to log into your website. They don't want to use your mobile app, right? They want to mention their company's cash. They want to manage their exposure and their risk, right? Their foreign exchange. What's the point of all this? And I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. I told you at the beginning this was going to be a bunch of obvious stuff, right? But the obvious thing is that you're not, as a bank, and the bank services are generally not the main thing, right? They're the facilitator to the main thing for pretty much everything in life. Finance is the oil that makes the engine go, right? But it's not the engine itself. It's not the destination, right? And so I want you to keep that in mind as we talk about what the strategy should be. So let's talk for a minute about bank branches. I know I'm out talking all these weird topics. I'll promise they'll come together. What's the purpose of a bank branch? Customer acquisition, right? Customer servicing, and as part of customer servicing, upsell, right? Which is kind of back to acquisition in a way, right? And every bank probably has teams of people that think about where we should put the bank branch, right? And they look at probably 30 or 40 things. I just have a very small list here of what determines where we would put that bank branch so that we can acquire the customers or service the customers that we want to acquire and service, right? Do you guys have Credit Agricole here locally anywhere? Is that a bank branch? Is that, the French bank? You have some? Yeah. So I live in Silicon Valley, and there's Credit Agricole branches about an hour from me. If I drive an hour east or an hour south, I can find Credit Agricole branches. And the reason is because an hour east is the Central Valley, and an hour south is the #1 garlic growing area for the United States. Like 90-something% of all garlic is grown in Gilroy, California. It's about a little less than an hour. And they're specialists in agriculture financing. So of course, they're going to open a branch there, right? And of course, if you're financing oil equipment, right, you probably have branches at Fort McHenry or someplace like that, right, or out in Edmonton, because, of course, that's where your customers are, and that's where you're going to have your bank branch. And you're sitting there thinking, okay, this guy has to get to the point because he's all over the place. So what is the strategy then where software is eating everything and there's platforms that are arising that customers are doing business on and consumption is crucial? I told you it wasn't going to be sophisticated, but hopefully something you've been thinking about. Digital branches, right? Embedding services into platforms and ecosystems where your customers are. Way easier said than done, but not done very well today, right? Because we're mostly distracted by open banking. With regulators saying, thou shalt open these APIs, I think that noise from the last couple of years has really crowded out what people really should be thinking about, which is in this new competitive landscape, with these new trends and dynamics of software and platforms, right, and consumption, how do I go to market and compete in this world, right? And having a digital branch strategy is really the way it is, because like we were talking about, customers really don't want the mortgage, and they're not interested in reading their bank statement, but they're super interested in having the house and managing their cash and managing their FX exposure, right? And wherever your segment is that you're addressing, they're really interested in that. But it needs to happen in a very easy to consume way inside of the experiences that they're using, right, and where they are. And there's a huge opportunity to do this. So I worked with the designer on this because, they had to scrub out all my non-compliant photos. And I told her, I said, I want a digital bank. And so she had this matrix idea because I saw the matrix, right? I love it. But you have to think about, okay, if I've got a digital branch, like you have to have a digital branch team, right? The same thought process that goes into opening a physical branch has to go into what are my digital branch strategy going to be, right? Where are my customers? How can I get myself into those markets so that I can acquire and service customers where they are, right? And I'm asserting to you that there is an actual team that needs to be formed inside of your bank to do this. Multiple teams based on the products, right? There might be a corporate treasury team that does this, digital branch strategy team, and there's probably a consumer finance team that should be doing this, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'll give you a couple really quick examples. So early on in my open banking travels, one of the Irish banks became a customer, and we were talking to them because our first project was obviously compliance, right? So we're doing the compliance thing, but then the guy pulled me aside. He said, over the last couple months, I've had like a half dozen accountants pull me aside and said, I have tons of clients that I service, and the experience of getting our data into our accounting packages is horrible. And if you could just fix that, I'll bring you like n dozen customers. Like each accountant was basically saying this. And so this bank executive was super excited about doing this because he was like, it is really, really hard to get anybody to switch banks, right? And he was head of small business banking, so he said, I need to be in QuickBooks, I need to be in Xero, I need to be in FreshBooks, and not just, hey, download your CSV, because that sucks, but being able to actually push a button, see all your data, be able to manage it, be able to manage payments, be able to open accounts, all inside of that experience. And that's really where his head was going. So whether it's SMB banking or maybe if you're in corporate treasury, where's your best controllers? Like, what experience are they in? Are they in SAP? Are you there? If you're not, you need to be, because that's where they want to manage their money, right? Another example, this is a customer example, Western Union. They actually built a chatbot inside of Facebook. So if you could just imagine, you're chatting with your friends, or let's say you're working overseas in a Canadian oil field, and you're talking to your family back home in chat, and you can actually send them money right there. So it's in hindsight, it's a pretty obvious thing, but they had the idea that, look, people want to send remittances. They're talking to their family. Let's essentially open a branch inside of Facebook to enable them, our customers, to do that. We'll gain advantage by being right there when they want to do it versus having them go someplace else or whatever. And you might think, okay, well, how hard is it to switch over from Facebook into my Western Union app and do this? Well, it's enough that it'll stop some percentage of people, right? Digital branches. And of course, the API guy would tell you this, but APIs are the foundation for digital branches. And I can see, like, probably some of the technology guys are like, I told you so. But it's a business conversation, right? It's not a technology conversation, right? Because it's even though I'm using the digital branch team, the technology guys will think of that as the API team, right? But these seamless, interoperable experiences built inside of these platforms are powered by APIs. So let's talk about how to do this. This is not easy. And one of the main reasons it's not easy has nothing to do with the technology. It's not easy because now you're talking about taking your proud brand, 100 whatever years old, and put it inside of somebody else's experience. And can you imagine having a conversation with the CMO? I can see the smile already. He's like, nah, no way, man. Yeah, so it's a difficult discussion to have, and it takes, C-level support to do that. And besides, it's going to take, like I said, you're going to have a digital branch team, which means you have to be staffed. It means funding for this program. It means proper KPIs and proper expectations of what this is going to mean for your company. And again, I think a lot of this stuff has gotten lost in the, open banking and the regulators are coming and it's being mandated and they're forcing us to do this. That's all compliance stuff, and frankly, I've spent a couple of years talking about that. And all of our bank customers that we're talking to now, we're done talking about that. We're talking about these topics, which is how to compete in this world that's coming, right? And the last thing that you would expect me to say about this is that the consumption experience is super, super important. And this is one thing that often gets lost because when it's a technology discussion, right, then the consumption somehow is like completely lost on people. It's like, oh yeah, it's just technology. We've got smart technology guys, and they're going to handle it, whatever. If you don't think it's important, maybe you haven't heard of these guys. So the Collison brothers took like some really hard bank stuff like payments and making a payment get executed properly in the context of e-commerce and built a massive company around it. And so and they just did that by thinking about the consumption experience of the developer, because the developer is the consumer of that API, right? Even though we're talking about it at a business level of, hey, where are you going to open your digital branch? That gets executed by a technologist, right? And that has to be a really easy process. And so if these two guys can build this massive startup just by focusing on that, by making that experience not suck, how many other bank processes, bank products exist that are super hard to consume right now? I can guarantee you there's fintechs being funded to go after this kind of thing. And as an aside, just as another data point to this, anybody familiar with Twilio? Talking about? Yeah, a bunch of you are. So early on in the life of Apogee, because at the time the iPhone had come out and there was a lot of disruption in the mobile network space, most of the mobile networks, large mobile networks on the planet became Apogee customers. And we were working with them to try to get them to open their APIs. And this would be relevant. This is a relevant story in two ways. But it was really difficult, right? Because there's complex networks with something inside of it called an SMSC that actually does the sending of the SMS message. And most major networks have been built up because of acquisitions of different networks that came together. And so it was really hard. But Twilio came and made it super easy. And that's a $16 billion public company right now by just simplifying that one function and then building on top of it. So when I look at banking and I think about all the fantastic things that come out of banks, but how complex and hard it is, I just see a bunch of really big startups trying to make it easier, especially in a software-driven world. They're trying to make it easier for developers, right? Which means making the API consumption process a lot easier. So a couple other things about that. Banks have the same problem that the telcos had, because the telcos don't represent an entire market. They're fragmented, right? And you go to Bell or you go to Rogers, and they're going to have different APIs for the same thing. And so standardization becomes super important, right? And so I know you're probably being beat over the head for the last few years about standardization and all the standards that are coming out and Swift and all that kind of stuff. That's actually, it's good, but it's not enough. And it's not enough, and Twilio showed us that it's not enough, right? Because even if all those APIs, they're all represent, if you can imagine, they all represent Canadian banks. If you're the developer and they're supposedly standard, first off, they're probably not exactly standard, right? And then second, you still have to do the work across all of them to get all market coverage if you want to address all the consumers in a market, right? And then that's only Canada. If your target is North America, then you really have problems. So, and I know this is a little bit of blasphemy, but the other thing that you might have to consider is aggregation. The Scotiabank person working with the RBC person to plug their APIs into a platform that makes it consumable. And I know this is crazy talk, but again, I'll go back to our first discussion about major trends. Like, those are major trends, they're not stopping. They're going to go with or without everybody in this room, right? So the move to software and the move to platforms almost requires something like this, because you think about all the major platforms and places you want to be, and it's much easier to work with one company than it is to work with 30 or 40. And I'll give you a side story on that, just as an illustration. So we're working, I'm part of a group that's working with Swift. Swift is one of our customers. So if you're familiar with Swift and GPI, that's a bunch of APIs to make cross-border payments more transparent. And one of the things we're doing with Swift is we're working on this API standard for paying later. Right? If you've heard of Klarna, Klarna or Afterpay in the US, you might be more familiar with them. Pay later. But anyways, so we're working on this standard, and because we had a bunch of banks together, and this is all in Europe, we had a bunch of banks together, and we wanted to plug this in, and we went to a major e-commerce company who I'm on the payroll of, and we said, hey, we've got this spec, and I've got these banks that are interested in releasing this. They want to do financing at the point of sale, and wouldn't this be awesome? And I just happened to have some inside knowledge that they really wanted to finance expensive devices at the point of sale, right, to make more sales. Pretty obvious stuff, right? Nothing too sophisticated. But it's easier for them to work with a Klarna than it is to work with, the CMA9. Which then it dawned on me like, we really need to start thinking about making this really consumable in a very simple way and having that kind of a value chain in place. So I knew I was going to fly through this and leave plenty of time to either have questions or give you guys some time back. So we're going to talk about our last topic, which is possible disruption. Don't get too fixated on the numbers. This is a four-party model. Everybody's familiar with it, right? When you think about the things we're working on here today in Canada, right, and other countries around the world, there will be a time not too long from now when the payment scheme will be real time. Not today, not everywhere, but it's coming. And most countries in the next 2 to 5 years will have real-time rails on the back end, right? Then you think about the second trend coming. Maybe I should have put some of this in the trend section. The second trend coming, which is regulators who are mandating APIs for payment. And so you think if banks have APIs for payment initiation and they have real-time rails on the back end between them, then what is this for? And again, I know this is crazy talk, but it's coming. Because you can clearly imagine a world where there's some kind of a software network up front to initiate these payments, and possibly, not necessarily, but possibly, the merchant network and the card network collapse into this software layer. And yes, I know, the card networks do lots of other things. It's not just the actual payment. There's a bundle of services, but we see in disruption where bundles of services get unbundled, right? And so this eventuality is partly why myself and a group of others around Swift are working on this pay later standard in Europe, because we think it's really important that banks be ready for this possibility as this happens. And you say, hey, well, this is a pretty slow roll. It's going to be a little while before the real-time rails are here. It's going to be maybe even longer in some countries before the payment initiation is here. I've got plenty of time, but you also know how fast your bank operates. And it's going to take time to get ready for something like this, right? And if you think it's too far off, you can look at India today, right? So in actuality, this is already happening, or in the process of happening, has happened, continuing to happen, where and I know in this particular case, there's some special situations, right? So in India, there's not great cards, four-party penetration. So I get that. They also had their identity system at Aadhaar, right? So that was available. But I know other countries that are also working on identity systems. So it's not entirely out of the question that this kind of thing, could come to a country near you. But I would actually assert that if done right and prepared for properly, that, I don't know why, I guess I'm right-handed. I keep going this way, sorry, over here. This is actually a good outcome, because the other outcome of what's happening, and there was a session on this earlier today that I couldn't go listen to, but I pretty much have an idea of how it went, is actually not that great. Who's familiar with Alipay and WeChat and what's happening? right? That's actually a not good outcome that we're trying to avoid, right? And that's a big part of what we're trying to do with this SWIFT alliance, right? And in this particular case, Chinese person gets paid, they transfer money into their wallet, and like that's it. All the payments and the commerce happens in there, and maybe occasionally some of the money will pop back out, maybe not, because they're just paying for stuff inside of that experience, right? And we would much rather have a world where the current account is the payment instrument, right, than one where it's something else. And so that's why when we think about these big trends, I know I'm repeating myself, but if there's anything, I want you to leave with this stuff, right? Software eating this entire experience, these large platforms and ecosystem players coming in, right? And I'll even give one other color because it looks like I totally have lots of time. Everybody saw the announcement with Apple and Goldman? Yeah, Goldman financing phones. How many other opportunities are there going to be? Not many, right? They lock that up very nicely, right? And so we would love to have banks who think about, I'm going to get to the action plan in a second here, but we would love to have banks that think about how do we make ourselves available and open for business in these software platforms and easy to work with, right? And I don't have like a prescriptive answer for each and every line of business because it's going to be different. SMB to corporate to consumer lending to other things, right? But you really need to start thinking through, let's get our digital branch teams together to come up with that strategy so that we don't end up in this kind of a world. So I'm at the conclusion. We kind of wandered around a little bit, but what did we talk about? So we talked about everything's moving to software, right? Your customers are moving to software. And you should think about how to be where your customers are instead of trying to drive them to your mobile app. Try to go to where they are and where they're trying to do their business. With your digital branch strategy, have a digital branch team, right? That is your API team, right? Maybe plus. You absolutely, positively cannot do this from a technology perspective, you technologists in the room. You need to get C-level business support for this because there's huge issues, right, around selling products in other people's platforms and the compliance implications and things like that. It would be no different if you were to try to open a branch in a foreign market. It's that kind of a change. So do not underestimate how big of a deal this kind of effort's going to be. And you have to pay attention to consumption. Consumption on standards, possibly working together with your fellow competitors to make it very easy so that you ensure that your current account is the payment mechanism and not something else becomes the payment mechanism because you weren't paying attention to it. And that is it. So thank you. If we have questions or dialogue, I'm happy to do that. You had your hand up first, so we'll start here.
You mentioned that APIs are the key to the integration for the digital branches.
Yeah.
Now, a couple of days ago, CIBC made an announcement that they are going ahead with introducing a platform that contains a financial CRM system plus banking, all of them together for small and medium-sized businesses.
Yeah.
What do you think about this approach? Because it's different from what you're talking about.
I haven't seen it, so I will have to check it out. And if they can get consumption on that, right? The challenge, just my reaction to that without having read it, and I can go check it out and we can trade emails later. You still have to get the consumption, right? So my first question is, how is that different from their own mobile app? Yeah, they built out an experience, and if it's a CRM system that they're building.
It's totally integrated. What they mentioned in there is it's totally integrated, one single platform, they don't go to their QuickBooks or to Xero or Sage or whatever.
Yeah, and so reading between the lines on that, just because I somehow see how the gears turn inside of banks. They probably came to the conclusion that it's too risky to go into somebody else's platform. And so instead, we're going to try to have our own experience. And so I would hope that they have a fantastic experience and sales team.
It's two-way integration.
Two-way
It is so it's
with.
back and forth. Before we take offline, feel free to check out CIBC Smart Bank.
CIBC guy right here. Should be asking him. Yeah. So I mean, but at a higher level, if they've got integration with other CRM systems, awesome. Then they've been thinking about this and are trying to execute this kind of strategy in the SMB type world. If they're trying to own their own experience, Godspeed, because you've got a whole other set of problems that you have to deal with. But there was a question over here. Yeah.
Two questions. In the slide on India,
Yes.
API was what? United? And why is not there a standard for APIs yet? Or is there?
There's standard in India?
No, in general. Like
In
API
general.
doesn't have a standards.
Yeah.
as yet.
Oh, yes. I would love for there to be one. I totally agree.
Really being used too loosely, to be honest.
Yeah.
From a technologist perspective, if I say
Yeah.
there are standards to develop the interfaces for applications, which practically means application programmable interface.
Yeah, yeah.
And APIs are being used too loosely to define the standards for that.
Yeah. So you bring up a good point, though, right? Is that different countries are putting out standards for APIs, specifically banking APIs, right? So there are a set of standards coming out of the Berlin group for the EU around PSD2, right? There is another set of standards that are coming out for open banking in the UK. I'm aware that there are other countries, Israel and some in Asia, that are basically just looking at the UK standards and just copying and pasting, right? Which the UK standards are okay; they're not great. They've got some problems with them. But you're totally right that there is no global standard, right, for APIs around payment initiation or account aggregation. And there's aggregators that are coming out that are trying to do what I was explaining. So in Europe, there's companies like Token or TrueLayer, and these are tiny startups, right? They're not going to move the needle much, but they are essentially trying to execute that kind of aggregation strategy on top of the banks, or like a Plaid, that type of company in the U.S. that's trying to do that for account information.
So then Apigee, who started APIs, why are they not trying to get standardized?
Yeah.
Big companies like yourselves, Google or something.
Yeah, so we didn't start APIs, but we're API infrastructure for banks. So banks that want to open APIs would use us, and we have many bank customers that do that. And yes, so we are involved in helping to kickstart the effort with Swift and something like Pay Later as a first step. But request to pay and a lot of other things really need to happen at a global level, and primarily they're being driven by in-country regulators right now. Behind, yes.
Would you say, first of all, great presentation.
Oh,
but
thank you.
Would you say that what we're going through now is similar to what department stores went 30 years ago, when in order to keep their relevance, some of them became malls, and then you had a multiple group of vendors using the same space and specializing in specific services. If that is true, why do you say that, so to speak, comparing, banks should start talking with each other, not as independent department stores turning into malls of services, but what would be the common problems they have to address as a group?
Yeah, such a great question. Such a great question. The answer is both. So I'm going to interpret your question, right? I'm promoting here, trying to collaborate and work together to work with the large platforms. Because there are already some platforms that probably could use financing, right? Because a bank is a balance sheet at the end of the day, and just in different contexts a lot of times, right? And so releasing the APIs in a consumable way, and I'll lean back on the pay later standard because we're looking at what's happening in China and what's happening in India, and we're trying to bring the banks along to collaborate on the standard and possibly aggregate. We're not there yet, just to be clear, to get themselves in other platforms. There's another school of thought, right, which says, hey, I want to participate in other people's ecosystems, but I myself want to become an ecosystem, which is what you're referring to at the malls, right? And yes, I totally agree. I think that is a great strategy. That is even harder. And I wouldn't tell you to not try to do that. Getting any of those platforms started is an incredibly difficult journey that requires, a decade and $1 billion kind of type of thing, right? If you're successful as a bank, and you see some banks trying to do this, popular examples would be somebody like Starling in the UK, if you want to go look at them, right? They are trying to become kind of a supermarket of fintechs with a set of APIs and enable them that way. So I don't disagree at all that that's another great strategy to do, but I would like the banks, at least in this room, to just take the first step. You bootstrap yourself by participating in some other ecosystems and building out the capability of having APIs and taking API products to market. Who else? There was somebody else over here. Yep.
Just a point, perhaps of clarification. I'm not sure which APIs you referred to for the telcos, but in fact in Canada there are standardized APIs across all the big telcos,
Yeah.
including Videotron and SaskTel are joining for consumption of identity information,
Yes.
so CRM data,
Yeah.
as well as the device information APIs to prevent account takeover, such as SIM swap, device change, etc. So, and they're consumable through Endstream.
That is awesome. Yes. And as part of my experience at Apogee, we actually acquired a joint venture of a bunch of telcos to try to standardize globally APIs. And so if you go to GSMA and you look at the Mobile Connect, it's a global standard for telco network identity. We bootstrapped that and then rolled it back into GSMA, which was successful and very not successful. But that's a whole other hour conversation. Yes?
I just want to add 2 points on your India and China's, right?
Yeah.
China model also exists in India, but it's not as bad as China. And it's not just 2 players, there are like at least 7 or 8 players in the market.
Yep.
And
Agree.
in that, the UPI thing, it's not just, it started as a P2P scheme.
Yep.
Scheme. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but American Express actually has integrated that thing into their app. So UPI conventionally is linked to the bank account, but American Express allows you to pay from your card over the UPI network. So, American Express still managed to get into there where software was eating it.
Yeah, and for full disclosure, American Express is also an Apogee customer. but yes, I totally agree. Anybody else? This is a great discussion, by the way.
Just a small point to add. If people are wondering, Google or Paytm, what they make out of this transaction, they really don't. But then they've also started lending services to that very platform. So now the banks conventionally are into lending, but now they're taking away a portion of it the way Apple's and Google are doing on it.
Yeah, which is kind of the dangerous part of it sometimes too, right? Because you have other players that come in that have, it's not the technology disruption that's actually a big deal. It's the business models that are not aligned, right? That can really be a problem.
Yes, well, it's like there is a space where someone else can just get into and pet your profits.
Right.
I'm just wondering, when you mentioned the slide where you had China and WeChat,
Yep.
that's not where we want to go. I'm really curious why you said that because, I work in Dubai and
Yeah.
there the concept of an e-wallet is actually huge, especially because, a large portion of the population, like over 40% are laborers who came from India, Pakistan, and whatnot, and they're
Yeah.
unbanked.
Yeah.
So the e-wallet is the way they get paid and how they send money to their families, etc. So I'm just curious why your reluctance around if that were to be the path you go.
Any bankers have opinions on that? I mean, I can give you my own, but if there's a banker that can say it, probably better than me. Anybody want to answer that? Yes. Disintermediation, right? You lose most of the context of all those transactions and everything else, right, is what it comes down to. And there was I won't tell you, so there was a large bank in a Asian country that had plenty of unbanked people who saw WeChat, Alipay come in and just take huge share. And they basically, because they're partially state-owned, they just went to the regulator and said, hey, this has got to stop, right? And refactored it so that the wallet was a representation of the current account in the regulation. So, I mean, that's another way to kind of address this.
I guess that was actually, so maybe I apologize, I didn't phrase my question properly. I wasn't thinking WeChat specifically, but the example I gave was happening in Dubai. It actually is owned and managed by the central bank.
Yeah.
So there is intermediation, there is oversight, et cetera. So I'm just thinking if that were to become an available, payment instrument even in North America.
Then it just depends on whose shoes your feet are standing in, right? Of whether that's a good thing or not. From the central bank, if they're trying to get inclusion, it might seem like it's an okay thing. If you're not a state-owned bank and all those customers go that way, then it may not be as great of a deal. There was another question. Yep. Look at you.
On your home buying example where you had that chain of events, right? You mentioned about embedding an experience. So
Yeah.
if a financial institution embeds their experience in this chain, what is the role of data sharing across these groups? Because is it really for, say, a bank to sort of partner with identify their members that are currently going through a home buying experience, or is there an opportunity to get the data across, say, from a realtor to see what the leads are? Where does the data sharing to sort of drive the business intelligence come from?
That's the magic that you need to figure out. I totally agree. I like the way you're thinking. And in the exercise that we did around Pay Later, which is not home buying, but phone buying or laptop buying or something, right? We specifically designed at least the first version of that API spec so that the bank was financing their own customers, because all the banks involved were kind of like, hey, we're not going to do communal customers, but the same kind of wheels we're turning into that scenario is you're bringing up is, okay, where in that transaction flow can we be, and what information can we get or share about either creditworthiness or shopping habits or other things. And I think that's a super innovative part of this, right? Now, all that's really exciting. I also know that when those people left and went back to their banks, they had to have conversations, with the risk people about all this stuff, right? Which is a good deal of why it's taken so long for that to come out. So.
Yeah, my question was a corollary to that. In the good slide that you put up, which was the India solution, there was an element of digital ID that was
Yes.
you hinted at. Was
Adhar.
So when banks think about embedding their services, particularly when there's a value chain of third-party providers, do you think it's necessary for there to be some element of externally imposed and universal identity verification that banks can rely on before they go to that embedded strategy?
It sure helps, right? So it certainly helped in India, and I think that you wouldn't see the growth of Paytm or Tez, Google Pay, without that. That was a key ingredient, because when you step way back and you say, okay, what is payments? It's really authentication and authorization and messaging today is basically what it is, right? With some risk checks and other things. And so that's a key ingredient that you need to figure out. And whether it's the government putting it on, banks coming together and say, hey, look, this is important for us, to own this and making that experience absolutely fantastic. Because I don't know how many people use log in with Google. That's a pretty good experience. I'm not on that team, but that's a good experience, right? And if Google can back that up with something that's super secure, that's really valuable. It can do a lot with that, right? right? And so as you're thinking about secure key or other things that your bank is supporting, you have to hold that up as a standard and say, hey, how do we make it look just like that? Certainly we use that example in the pay later design that we did. Is there another one over here? This is a great conversation. It's better than my talk, actually. Anybody else? Yep.
What's been your general view in talking to banks about your platform potentially being a competitor to?
Sorry, I'm not catching you.
I'm just curious, in discussions you've had with banks that talk mobile is that
Yep.
you see Google as the potential ultimate competitor.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And how they feel
Yeah. Yeah, we get that. We get that a little, but two things. One, and again, you have to qualify like who is Google, right? When I go in and talk to a bank, I'm talking on behalf of Google Cloud, which is just infrastructure, right? But you can say, hey, but that other business unit over there is doing something maybe I don't like. I would think you're probably referring to pay. Now, but when you look at pay, it really facilitates card transactions. So anybody who's an issuer that is using pay, it's just one more facility for them. Right? I don't think there's anything competitive today. Even when you look at the, and again, this is all my editorial, right? But when you look at India and Google Pay, Tez in India, they're also using the current account, right? So it's not a wallet per se. So it's actually not that, if you really think it through, it's not that competitive.
So, here's a thought, I don't know, maybe it's a wide one. So when Google said
I like
that,
wide thoughts.
We need, AI is complex and we need a standard for that, and we need an easy way for everybody to create AI applications. You created TensorFlow and you put it out.
Yeah.
So why can't you do the same thing with open banking?
Yeah. Well,
So
yeah.
in a sense, create a framework, put it out, let fintechs adopt it, let banks adopt it, see what happens.
Possibly. And I think there could be efforts inside of someplace like Pay to do that kind of thing as they try to work with other banks.
Because here's the thing: if you try to bring everybody together on the same platform, it's going to take forever.
Yeah.
Right, and nobody's going to agree to it. So what happened in India was kind of it was a long effort. About the open source movement and all of that, and it was kind of a think tank, community based, and it was backed by the government, so they were fortunate.
Yeah.
I do not see the same kind of levers falling in place in every economy. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. Peace. I recognize that what I'm asking for is unnatural, and the real way to get a standard is for somebody to execute and win, and then everybody falls in line, right? And so instead, if you're trying to say, hey, let's come together before that happens and try to create a spec, like request to pay or pay later, it's a lot harder. And we've already kind of cut our teeth on that for about a year with the pay later spec, trying to get banks to agree and that kind of thing. And it's harder because we don't have the first use case, right? If we had Amazon or Google or some large e-commerce, right? Google's actually not a large e-commerce, but saying, hey, this is the way to do it, and everybody fall in line, you're right, it would be totally easier than trying to get people to agree. That's much harder. Yep.
So I come from transit industry, and Google Map has done an excellent job in using all the transit modes into a Google Map.
Yeah.
Why hasn't fare payment been part of that experience for a customer? Like I select I want to go from Toronto to Waterloo. Why can't fare be part of it? Why do I have to go to Go or TTC or Uber or whatever?
Yeah. I'm sure the maps, I don't know, because I'm not part of that team, but I'm sure they're thinking about it, right? Because they're constantly thinking about how to make it easier, right? And you see some maps like City Mapper that are getting closer. But it's still a pop-out experience, right? Yeah. We've got a minute. Anybody else? Right. 1, 2, 3. Okay. All right. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.